afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right, so this session, welcome. This session is going to talk about transitioning into a green economy, opportunities and challenges. So we're very fortunate to have here a wonderful panel representing across the different interest areas and topics within the green energy transition. So for the sake of time, we're just going to do a quick introduction so that we are each situated in terms of what backgrounds our wonderful panelists are coming from. So I apologize to all of you for really just not doing justice to your backgrounds, but just giving a brief intro of who you are. So first, we have the Honorable Paul Twum-Barimah. He hails from Ghana. He has in-depth experience in the energy sector, communications, corporate affairs management, community relations, external and government relations, and regulatory affairs. He's currently a member of the Ghanaian Parliament since 2021, and as MP, he serves on the Mines and Energy Committee and the Privileges Committees of Parliament. He currently also serves on the board, as a board member of Buai Power Authority, a power generating company, and also on the Ghana Publishing Company Board. Next to him, we have Kenneth P.K. Agyir. So he is a Ghanaian lawyer, climate and sustainable development activist. He is the National Director of Youth Alliance for Green Ghana, a youth-oriented nonprofit organization he co-founded in 2018 to mobilize and stimulate environmental and green development activism in Ghana. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for Transnational Environmental Accountability, works with activists and professionals across Africa to promote environmental and human rights accountability in Chinese economic undertakings in Africa. And he's also an associate lawyer at the Sam Okudesto and Associates in Ghana and a researcher at the African Center on Law and Ethics. And finally we have Chasity Mcfadden. She is an energy transitions analyst at Bloomberg and EF with over 2 years experience. She specializes in analyzing energy transition in countries with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa to provide a comprehensive view of global energy trends. She also has experience as a global data analyst where she assisted customers in understanding financial data products to aid them in personal analysis. She has skills in R programming and has previously worked as economics research assistant at Colby College, where she collected and analyzed data on biomass fuel production from stoves in West Africa and the prevalence of malaria. So we are absolutely honored to welcome all three of you on here. And so just a check on terms of how this is going to run, we're going to start with a couple of minutes of moderated Q&A, and then we're going to open it up to the audience in the last 10 or 15 minutes for your Q&A participation before we close out. And so I guess just to situate us in terms of what we're looking at for this, so we're talking about a green economy. But in talking about a green economy is invariably tied to the issue of energy transition, right? So the International Renewable Energy Agency defines energy transition as moving from fossil-based to zero carbon sources. So kind of my first question and opening to all of you is one, does this definition in terms of the primacy of energy transition in relation to green economy, does this fit within the African context? And is this an accurate capture of what is priority and what is necessary in Africa to transition over the long term into these new energy needs? So I'll start with Chasity, and then we could go down the line.
Okay, is this working? Okay, amazing. So I think that while the IEA definition of energy transition is pretty encapsulating, what it's missing is that in Africa we should be less concerned with transitioning away from fossil fuels and more concerned with incorporating new renewables. Because in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that 48% of the population lacks access to energy in the first place. So we need to be prioritizing renewable energy and that will make a transition to a green economy more effective. I think it is like a reasonable goalpost for African countries to reach. We're seeing that many African countries are obviously making this a priority. 36 out of 42 of the countries that we surveyed in particular have renewable energy targets. So this is something that is at the forefront of policy and government minds. It's something that needs to be, or continue to be at the forefront of people's minds in Africa as the world transitions to a green economy.
Okay, thank you very much. To whatever she said, clearly, yes, the definition really tells us about energy transition that we need. But clearly, as we say, we need to situate it very well in terms of looking at what other countries need and what they want. You cannot just have a general definition that you think will suit every African in terms of even the renewables. Each country has its own renewable that it can assess as we speak. Tunisia is talking about running out of dam water. Maybe if you come to Ghana, it might be more of energy in terms of solar. So yes, what you need to do is situate it based on each country and what fits the country. It cannot be a general definition. It cannot be the same way. Yes, it's about environmental protection. How does situate in each country? That is what we need to look at. As you said, we have over 100,000 people in Africa not having access to electricity. That is what we're talking about. How do we get electricity for them? Over 600,000 people don't use clean energy and clean cooking processes. What are we talking about there? That is what we are talking about. So you need to situate that definition to suit each country, and that is what will make it a more viable and something that we can all look out to.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Great to have you all here. I think just as my co-panelists have already mentioned, the International Renewable Energies Organization's definition is quite a broad and expansive definition of green transition. But in the context of Africa, of course, Africa has always had its peculiar needs, its peculiar challenges. And so in the context of Africa, we have to look at our specific gaps, our contribution even to the carbon, carbon emissions, to look at the shift from the carbon economy into this green economy. Because for other countries, in terms of this definition, you would perhaps require that they lead into that green economy. For most African countries already we are doing less than 3%, and so we are not that heavily dependent. And so, of course, it's important for African countries to contribute, just as the Rwandan minister mentioned that for African countries, what we have to do is to contribute to decarbonization. But really, if you seem to put the burden on African countries in the context of this, definition or this scope, then you are not addressing Africa's peculiar issues and peculiar needs and its contribution to the problem in itself. But I also think that green transition in Africa would mean going back to some of the things that we used to do, which were already green. Even in terms of culturally how we approach our lives in Africa. That's just a shift or a realignment with what we are already used to in Africa. And also take on the opportunity to take the lead, because we have over 60% of the world's solar endowment, and we've tapped into just about 1% of that. And so this shift allows us to take the lead as African countries and countries that are endowed with these clean energy sources. So the definition is quite general, but for each African country and for the context of Africa, reimagining its growth on its own terms, it presents challenges and also that opportunity for us to restore our way of life. Thank you.
Yeah. So I appreciate those comments. In talking about green transition, energy transition in Africa, you always fall into the conflict of like Africa. Like yes, Africa, but Africa, there's 54 versions of Africa, and 54 unique needs of Africa. But I guess just for the sake of the time in the panel here, we're going to try to encapsulate Africa as a whole, understanding that leaves a lot of nuance to the table. So I guess to this conversation, especially to you, Paul, working in government and having worked in the different sectors, public, private, within the government in energy. So you just mentioned that the global definition of an energy transition is broad and probably not suited for the specific needs of Africa in terms of energy access rather than energy decarbonization. So on the state level, as African states are part of the global conversation in terms of moving into greener energy sources, like how do states, African states in particular, kind of run that relationship in terms of their personal understanding of what their energy needs are, and that their short-term needs will probably include carbon-based fuels, whereas the rest of the world is pushing towards a greener, less carbon-fueled economy, but that's not currently what is needed or what is helpful for African development, at least in the short term. So how do you relate those two conversations?
I think it is important for us to appreciate that Africa cannot be industrialized on the back of renewables. It is important for us to appreciate. Indeed, you can think about the solar energy and all that. If we go to DR Congo has River Inga has one of the largest hydro potentials that we can develop up to like 40 gigawatts of energy. It can serve all of Africa. But who is going to make that investment? At this point, Africa needs something that can help it industrialize in terms of power. And what we need is how we can be able to build what we have. Renewables are good, as you're saying, we are happy we have a lot of them. Indeed, if you take our renewable service, we've only tapped into only 11% of our renewable services in terms of resources that we have. So we have a lot of potential. But in terms of developing it to use it as industrialization, it is not possible. We will have to take a longer time to develop it because, as you are saying, our needs. If we are talking about over 900,000 people who don't have electricity, it's my duty to find how they get power. If we take recently, Germany, when they had issues with their gas and all those things, they fell on coal. They needed to think about their citizens first before thinking about what the global is talking about. If you're talking about global, then we need to look at how are we going to invest in Africa in that level for them to be at the same point with other countries. As you said, we don't generate anything in terms of these emissions. Why you want us to come and pay for something we've not generated? Especially when you are talking about at the recent COP 27 or they are talking about 1 trillion to 3.5 trillion needed to be able to put us at that level, and they are talking about 2050. When Ghana, in our transition, we are looking at 2070. That's what we are looking at. Indeed, let's establish the fact that every African country is ready to move into the transition session or whatever it is like. But the processes and how we are going to go through and the pace must be looked at. We cannot move at the same pace. Now, America is saying they want to come up with about 140 gigawatts of energy from wind and solar. That's going to cost a lot of money. They have regulatory problems as well. But do we have it? But India, if I go to India, India will tell you we have about 60% of our land used for agriculture. Our people need their land, looking at their land. Will they talk about going to use about 60% of their land, clear farms, and use it for the solar farms? So Africa is ready for the transition. But all we are saying is that we need the processes, we need the pace. Let us give us a pace. I mean, we are just coming up with our party in terms of this carbon fossil fuel. You talk about what the professor was saying. Uganda has discovered oil. They are yet to tap into it. But we are in this country. Texas developed on the basis of hydrocarbons. UAE developed on the basis of hydrocarbons. And in terms of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and all those people. So we are yet to tap into it. As much as we believe that, yes, we must encourage this energy transition, we also believe that the processes and the pace must be on our own terms. That is why this year's, in terms of the theme, really sings along with whatever it is. It must be on our terms. You cannot just push us that, oh, we are all going, so we have to go along. It cannot be so. So it is important that we appreciate that Africa is ready. Africa wants to be part of this transition. If you come to Ghana, we have an energy transition team. They are engaging almost every stakeholder. They are engaging the religious bodies, they are engaging the transitional authorities. They are doing a lot. In terms of the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources, every year we come up with a program that plants over 200 million, over 20 million trees every year. These are all in the process of supporting the transition. But there are certain areas that we need to take it step by step. We are not saying give us the baby steps, but we must be able to give it a certain time to get to that one. And that is what Africa is looking about. Africa is ready for everything, but we need a pace that we can do this.
Yeah. So I like that. So I'm interested to hear your reaction, Chasity, since you do work in the larger energy transition space, focusing, have a more broader continental view. What are some of trends that you're seeing across the continent in terms of how individual states or regional bodies are addressing this energy transition, both to fit the global narrative of cleaner energy and renewables, but also to recognize their own short-term needs in terms of investing in maybe more carbon-based fuel for their long-term growth?
Sure. So I think it's very important to note that this is very country to country based on the resources that are available. What we're talking about in Kenya is very different than what we're talking about in Nigeria versus South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. These are all very different conversations. That being said, on a more continental framework, we're seeing that there's very little investment compared to global trends. In 2021, there was only $2.6 billion of investment that went into Africa. For context, that's about 0.6% of global numbers. And even within that, the financing itself is super duper concentrated. Most of the financing, about 3/4 since 2010, is going into Kenya, Egypt, Morocco, South Africa. And that's both international and domestic financing. And then when we're looking more at domestic financing, we're seeing that's even more concentrated specifically in South Africa through their renewable energy auction programs. So the conversation on how we are switching to renewables versus your hydrocarbon sources is a little complicated because you have this country to country focus and these investment trends that we're seeing. But on a bright side, we are seeing that a lot of African countries are investing in solar. Solar seems to be the energy of choice, which makes a lot of sense considering the resource across the continent. To give you some numbers, there we go. 24 countries installed more than 1 megawatt of solar in 2021, and this is much higher than previous years. So there is this trend in Africa where we are focusing more on renewable energy and less on hydrocarbons. That being said, there is potential for hydrocarbons to play a critical role in development in Africa. In our modeling, gas plays a role for at least the medium term in terms of building capacity. What the focus seems to be, and this is a global focus as well as in Africa, is we are trying to decommission coal as soon as possible. So we are getting rid of the heaviest polluters and pulling on renewable energy and taking advantage of the resources that Africa has. So there is potential for development to be through renewables, depending on where you're talking about, that really could sort of change the framework of how we think about development. We really rely on these frameworks of like how the US did it, how Europe did it, how the Middle East did it, but like we acknowledge here that Africa is different. And if we are to develop Africa on Africa's terms, then we need to take that into consideration and not focus on how everybody else did it and how we should match those trends when there are so many resources to do it differently.
Yeah.
Hello? Yes, so they've all made some really interesting points, which I can very much relate to, from the perspective of someone who engages with young people, on this whole transition. And so I shared the flyer for this panel just about 3 days ago, and a colleague of mine, reached out to me asking, so don't you think this whole transition has set in another world order where Africans are still getting behind? Because even for those countries that are pushing, getting Africans, telling Africans that you should act urgent, these are countries that seem to have taken the lead, even in the green transition. There are countries that have built the infrastructure for, electric cars. They have what it takes to be ahead of Africa. And so if these countries, these states, these institutions are pushing Africans to move from what you rely on for your development to what they think should be that resource that you are going to rely on for the new kind of development, then that is going to push you further, behind in terms of development, because in this same green transition, you are getting behind. So I think that from the points made by Chasity and the numbers that we have in it, and also from Honorable Paul, you realize that Africa, in terms of the current situation and in the future, projections and our actions, we need to look at the resources that we have. We need to look at the finances we have and balance it with our developmental needs. And that's really how we're able to assess whether we need to strike the balance between relying on what exists now and also trying to shift gradually into that kind of green economy that we are required to lead into. So that's my reaction to that, and that's also based on some debates that have come up on this subject. So are we really behind? Are we in terms of this green transition, are we getting ahead? We have all the resources to get ahead, but are we really being supported even amongst ourselves to get ahead of the world? So these are very critical questions that these figures will bring into more.
So I think that really plays into some of the earlier conversations, especially yesterday, in terms of the importance of recognizing the narrative, the specific narrative needs of Africa, both in terms of development, timelines, needs, all this other stuff. So maybe that's something we can get into a little bit more in the Q&A if anyone is interested in that. But shifting gears a little bit more. So this green economy, energy transition, all of them requires funding. It requires financing, and that's like the biggest elephant in the room. So a related kind of financing need is in the space of adaptation, like climate adaptation, and even that where there seems to be more global agreement in terms of this is a necessity, we're still seeing incredible shortages for financing for that. Less than 40% of what's needed per year, at least in climate adaptation for the continent, is less than 40% is met. So when we come to talk about green transitions, we're seeing even bigger funding gaps. So I guess particularly to Chasity and to Paul and to all three of you, what Chasity specifically, what does the financing landscape look like for greener projects within the continent, both external funders and internally? Are you seeing any shifts in terms of the clients that you work with and the projections that you deal with? Any shifts in terms of infused financing in this field? And for Paul, on the state side, is there a way that governments, especially governments who are still invested in carbon-based fuel, Ghana is, has oil and gas reserves, is there a shift in thinking about how to use, dirtier energy sources as a way to finance cleaner energy sources in the future? Like, what does that conversation look like on the national level, and then what does that conversation look like for investors, like external and internal investors? So, Paul, if you could start first.
Okay, talking about using a dirtier oil, I mean, if you talk about that, it's like somebody driving about 6-7 hours to Cambridge for a party, and when he got here, the party was on. The drinks were available, the food were available, but some people they were drunk, so I don't have my eggs and they were misbehaving. So when I got here, they said, "Oh, even though there are food and there's everything, you cannot eat, you cannot also drink because of how we are seeing it. However, you need to contribute for us to clear the mess of the people." That's what we are telling Africans. That most of these developed countries develop on hydrocarbons. Texas was developed at the back of hydrocarbon. I mean, the whole of America was developed at the back of hydrocarbon. I just mentioned the UAE. You mentioned the likes of Saudi, the likes of Qatar. Now the Africans have discovered, instead of them being developed what they have, they said, no, you can't develop it. But rather, you need to contribute for us to save the environment. How? How do you want us to survive? Exactly as I said, it is about the process. And as Chasity said, it's country specific. We cannot use the same framework for globally to fit every country. And Africa, I mean, Ghana is just about 10 years old in this oil and gas industry. Clearly, it is helping us. I mean, one doctor just said that Nigeria, their whole economy is dependent on the oil industry. So if you say they should collapse, where are they going? They don't have a non-oil sector. They are not trying to develop the non-oil sector. Ghana, our non-oil sector contributes a lot to our development, our GDP and everything. So it is important for us to appreciate that every country, the countries are willing. If you come to Ghana, we have an institution called Wind Power Authority. They've come up with about 50 megawatts of solar energy. They are undertaking 100 megawatts. They are doing another 4 megawatts somewhere. Clearly shows you that we are willing to move away from the normal, but you must give us the time. The process will take a bit longer, but we will get there. If you want us to move at your pace, then you don't expect us to produce our crude, come for it, take it and bring it back at a higher cost. You can't do that. So if you want us to talk on that time, then come to the table, let's sit across the table as businessmen, not come to give me a loan or an aid and direct me what to do, but tell me that, okay, listen, I'm come to establish the refinery, produce the oil there, refine it there, get the resources, and get that development that you need, and then we can come back to the table and discuss this. But at this point, every government in Africa is ready to move into the transition. But we believe that the pace must be discussed. It must be country specific. We have to take it a step at a time and be able to know that every country falls in at an appropriate time and not rushing it. Indeed, we talk about funding. They were talking about funding. Last COP15, at COP15, they decided to raise 100 billion. They ended up raising less than that. Just ended this COP. They are thinking about raising the 1 trillion to 3.5 trillion. I wondered how they're going to get it, because the first one they couldn't get it. So clearly, in terms of any funding, there's a whole challenges about it that we need to look at it. So we need to allow these Africans to be able to develop what they have and be able to appreciate that, yes, do it, but do it in a way that it can be safe for the environment. And we will all come back to the table and discuss how we're going to carry everybody along. But at this point, I think we cannot discuss the African leaving the hydrocarbons in the water or under the ground and struggling. Can we walk into IMF for 10 billion when you have something on the ground that can give you up to that? We cannot continue on that level. And I think it is our time that we have that discussion now. Africa is ready for the green economy, but what is the pace? that we are on.
Yeah, so I think the pace is also the real conversation here. Like I said, we don't really see gas not being a huge part of power mixes until 2040, 2050, depending on the country. So it's going to take some time to get there. But I really think that a conversation around green economies could be so helpful in thinking about development, because we could potentially, Africa could take advantage of their green resources and use those for development, or use them to encourage investors to come in and use their green grids, as all of these companies also make pledges to become net zero. So I think there's a lot of wiggle room there for how green economies could be utilized in terms of development. But you are right, there is a huge financing gap. The financing that is going to literally everywhere else in the world is ginormous compared to what is going into Africa. And some of that has to do with policy barriers and things like that, where investors don't feel comfortable going into Africa due to the barriers that are there, and also due to higher perceived risk than is actually there. So we recently published a report on this for COP last year, actually, called Pathfinders Africa. So if you want deeper information on this and more numbers, you're more than free to look that up and read that.
And so on the question of pace, I think that's really important to kind of distinguish. We all want the same end goal, but maybe the timeline of that end goal is a bit different, like continent-wide and countrywide. So I want to shift it a little bit over to you, Kenneth, since you work a lot on the ground with youth activists and on the civil society part in terms of environmental transition and needs. So I'm curious to know, like, what does this conversation look like on the citizen level? So we understand what the governments are talking about in terms of the need for individualized pacing, financing needs, and et cetera, et cetera. How does the youth, how does the general population, like, how do they interpret this conversation in terms of the relevance to their daily life and to their economic futures?
So, very important question, because this brings to the fore one of the challenges, if I would say, one of the challenges that arises from this conversation in the context of young people and where they see themselves in this whole mix. So we talk about pace, which would suggest time, right? So if we're going with the 2050 targets of net zero, that's about 27 years from now. For young people, that means that 2050 is when we would be the ones to take the critical decisions. How are countries that need time, and most African countries for that matter, positioning young people and engaging them in the conversations now, in the planning now, so that they can be able to take over? And so you find in local communities, young people telling you that, I know all of this. You don't have to come and tell me about climate change. You guys say it will take time. I mean, we are not seeing anything, and you are not involving us in anything. So perhaps we just destroy everything and we all go together. Exactly, because this is something that would happen if we were to look at the worst case scenario after about 30, 40 years, right? Some countries have said 2070. So if you look at the average age of an African leader, and in fact the front runners and the lead negotiators now, you are looking at about 45 years, 50 years, and by 2050, where would these people be? So you find young people yearning to be at the forefront of this, because we must sustain whatever is being done now. If you feel there's no experience, in terms of the young people leading the negotiations,
there are many ways to get them along to understand at the same level as the key players are doing. But you find, now what is termed youth washing, where young people should sit somewhere else to have their conversation, and then the so-called key players, government officials would also have their conversation. And then when the conversation is over, bring your inputs, let's see what the young people think about this. Yes, and then, it's all about, we'll consider it and you hear from us or something like that. So if we want to engage, and of course want to accept that it will take time, then time would also mean that you get people who would be ready and equipped when you gradually get to that time. And that has been the conversation, at the youth front, engaging young people. Get them involved at the same level. Have that intergenerational, conversations. Have that intergenerational work. Instead of putting young people aside and relying on the experience which is, available now for the older generation to do all the work that is required, but would need to be sustained in the long term. So at the level of young people, if African countries are going to realize that we have to reimagine our economic development, our green transition on our own terms, then we have to reimagine the resources that we need for that green transition. And I think that we've had gold and all the other resources that would come to mind when we talk about resources, but we've not considered the youth population as a resource in this transition. Because start now, but you need to sustain it. So would you want to start now and leave the scene and get a new generation that is inexperienced, that is now coming to try and fail, to take up from where, or the good work you may have done now? These are the critical questions we have to ask. And we have a burgeoning youth population. We are looking at about 46% of the world's population, 46% of the world's youth population by 2030, being from Africa. That's almost half. Now we know Africa's youth population is the highest in the world. So we have that population that could help us maintain and consolidate the gains that we seek to make in the long term and at our own pace. And that is what we need to look at, sustaining it. And that is what will convince young people that this green transition is for them. Of course, I know there are leaders here, government officials here, and you would admit that at some point you have to step back and get the young people to continue with what you've done. So would you want to look back and say, we put together these policies, we did all this research, we had these reports and everything, we led negotiations, but that has to be restarted because the young people don't understand the considerations that went into these key negotiations that we did. So at the level of young people and local communities, we need to look at the role of young people, the critical role of young people, not only as the numbers that we are given or the statistics, but also as a resource going into that green transition. Thank you.
Thank you. So Roy's just going to kill me because we're running late on time, but we're going to open it up to Q&A. So we're going to take a couple of questions at a time. Just a reminder, because of timing consideration, please ask a question that should end in a question mark, so no statements, please. So raise your hands and we'll call on you. Yes.
How do you feel about green growth versus degrowth because I know that everyone's talking about doing degrowth for the climate change. So for climate change, people talk about doing degrowth in Western countries, so they grow less and they not produce so much carbon emissions. So should African countries and Caribbean countries do green growth, so growth capitalism with the green economy, or should they do a degrowth and more sustainable development and live more sustainably?
Any other Keita.
I just wanted to ask if anyone has any thoughts about the broader electricity planning landscape in Africa. Are you finding that it's well developed, thinking about integrated resource planning, sort of these cost plans? And one thing I didn't necessarily hear was a discussion on nuclear. Could that potentially be a source that we exploit, and how would we sort of integrate it into the sort of energy resource planning space in Africa? Thank you.
So we could address those two first, and then move on to the so who wants to go first?
So, green growth versus degrowth. If I got it. Okay. So, one of the key, critical questions that you typically be confronted with as a climate activist or a green growth, advocate in Africa is, why are we pushing for something that requires that we do not grow as a continent economically? And my quick response has been, green growth in and of itself is growth. It's another direction of growth. You don't have to pause economic growth and socio-economic development to achieve, the green transition that we talk about. So just as growth in Africa has now focused on data and technology, like you're driving this direction and you get to a junction and you have to take your right to another path which will get you to that same destination, and you have to prepare yourself to achieve that, then why do we think we are being made to choose between growing and greening, our economies? It is growth in itself, in and of itself, if you look at it in that manner. And in most conversations, I have done some work on the Tiwa project in Ghana, and you are always confronted with the question, why do you think that, the forest should be conserved as opposed to bauxite exploration for, infrastructure and all the challenges we face, and that is going to stifle our growth as a country? I think that is another way of growth. There are countries that now are pushing ecotourism as the backbone of the economy. That's green growth, and that is no halt to the economy. And so I don't think green growth is always, in that sense, degrowth or a reversal or a pause in the growth, economic growth trends of the countries. It's just a way of looking at how to fit sustainability into your growth. And so if people are still going to drive cars, people are going to still industrialize, how do we find substitutes introduce substitutes in our factories or in our systems that will ensure that we shift from that carbon emissions or carbon pollution into cleaner energy sources, which is still economic development, which will give employment, which will empower the youth, and also ensure that we all live in a very safe and healthy, world. So I think that's my quick response to that question. I don't see any degrowth in green growth, to be honest. And then also Africa's energy, mix and the challenges. I think quickly that really reminds us of where we have to be looking at, because we keep investing all in the same sources in Africa, and the numbers are clear. You have solar. You need investment, but the same investment that you channel into the same sources that fail you could be channeled into these renewable energy sources, and for that time you are able to pilot it, you're able to better how you're able to tap into that resource you have.
So I'm sorry to cut you off, but they're going to kill me because we're at time. So I know Paul and Chasity, you wanted to input on some of the questions, especially the question in the Keita about electrification and other green sources. If you want to quickly comment on that.
Okay, let me quickly just top up with what my brother has said. In terms of America is thinking on that building a 140 gigawatts power, they are creating over 500,000 jobs. So clearly, the growth, they're adding up to their employment. So clearly, it's not the growth, just adding up to it. Bringing electric cars and people trying to import is adding up to the economy. It's growing. It's something that is adding up to the growth of the economy. So green economy is just adding up. It can never bring the economy back to where or try to degrow it or something. So I think just adding up. But in terms of electricity mix, yes, it's very important for me to say that even in Ghana, Ghana has up to 2030 about 10% of their energy in terms of national usage, 10 minutes of hydro in terms of the solar, 10%. As we speak, the nuclear, we are developing a nuclear, and very soon they are about establishing a nuclear site to be able to develop that that part of energy, to use it as part of their energy mix. The important part is in terms of how to handle the nuclear. It's the best, and if you want to say Africa, that's what Africa needs to develop, to industrialize. It's cheaper, it's cleaner, but in terms of handling it, it's critical. The most important aspect of it is the safety aspect of it. Can we handle it in such a way that we can get the best out of it? That is the only way. But a lot of countries are going to visit Ghana. I can confidently tell you, have started something that very soon Ghana is going to add nuclear to their energy mix.
So last word, Chasity?
Yeah, I think we talked enough about green growth versus degrowth, so I feel pretty content. To acknowledge your question on electricity planning, there are plans from most governments, but there's a lot of shakiness on whether or not those will actually be enacted, mainly because of a funding gap. So needing the money to actually implement these plans in terms of like transmission line buildings or increasing electrification is really where that gap is. And then to your question on nuclear, honestly, I don't think nuclear is going to play a huge role anytime soon. It's very expensive, it takes a lot of time to develop, while there are other sources that take less time, and we're seeing are going to be significantly less expensive than hydrocarbon comparisons. So there is potential for nuclear, but we don't see that coming online for a very, very long time, so probably will not play any role for the short term.
All right, so many wonderful points brought up. We could spend a lot more time talking about them, but we're already over. So I want to thank Chasity, Paul, Kenneth for your wonderful expertise and time and patience, and for all of you for your participations and for joining us today. So thank you very much. I think the run-up show is that we are going back to the plenary for a keynote, or for the closing remarks, and then we will kind of commence for it. So thank you everyone for your participation.
Yes, everybody, you have 15 minutes until the keynote, and then short video and a closing remarks. So grab coffee, food, and then make your way back into the paper.